The gunshot that rang through the dusty streets of Casa Grande, Arizona, that scorching afternoon in July of 1882, was not what changed Eleanor Ramsey's life forever, though it came close enough to her head that she felt the heat of the bullet pass by her ear. What changed everything was what she did next, standing in the middle of Main Street with her heart pounding like a war drum, her green eyes blazing as she turned to face the crowd of townspeople who had gathered outside the general store. She opened her mouth and said exactly what she thought about the land dispute that had nearly gotten her killed, and the words that poured out were sharp and clear and unbending as iron. "That water belongs to everyone in this territory," she declared, her voice carrying across the shocked silence. "Not just to the men who think they can buy it up and hoard it like gold while families go thirsty in their homes." The men on the wooden sidewalk stared at her like she had sprouted horns. Women clutched their shopping baskets tighter and looked away. Even the horses seemed to go still, their tails swishing lazily in the oppressive heat. Eleanor felt the weight of their judgment pressing down on her shoulders, heavier than the Arizona sun that beat relentlessly on the top of her head through her wide-brimmed hat. "Miss Ramsey," said Gerald Thompson, the owner of the general store, his mustache twitching with barely contained irritation, "perhaps you should leave matters of business and law to those who understand such things." "I understand perfectly well," Eleanor shot back, her hands clenched at her sides. "I understand that families are leaving because they cannot afford the prices that certain men are charging for access to the creek. I understand that children are getting sick from drinking dirty water because their parents have no other choice." "You understand nothing," snapped Harrison Wells, one of the wealthiest ranchers in the area, stepping forward with his thumbs hooked in his belt. "You are a woman, and an unmarried one at that. Your place is not to speak on matters that do not concern you." The words stung more than Eleanor wanted to admit, but she held her ground. She had come to Casa Grande 6 months ago to help her aunt run the boarding house after her uncle had passed away, and in that short time she had seen enough injustice to fill a lifetime. She had watched good people suffer while men like Wells grew fat on their desperation. She had held her tongue for too long, swallowing her opinions like bitter medicine, until today when she simply could not stay silent anymore. "It concerns everyone in this town," she said quietly, but there was steel in her voice. "And I will not pretend otherwise just because it makes you uncomfortable to hear a woman speak her mind." The crowd erupted in murmurs, some shocked, some angry. Eleanor felt her cheeks flush hot, partly from the heat and partly from the shame of being so publicly rebuked. She knew what they were saying about her, the whispered words that followed her like shadows, opinionated, difficult, unladylike, unmarriageable. Each word was a small cut, and together they bled her dry. That was when she heard the sound of boots on the wooden planks behind her, slow and deliberate. The crowd's attention shifted, and Eleanor turned to see a man emerging from the shadow of the saloon awning. He was tall and lean, with dark hair that touched his collar and eyes the color of storm clouds. He wore dusty trail clothes and a gun belt slung low on his hips, and there was something in the way he carried himself that spoke of danger and competence in equal measure. "Seems to me," the stranger said, his voice a low drawl that cut through the tension like a knife through butter, "that the lady has a point." Harrison Wells' face turned an unflattering shade of purple. "This is none of your business, stranger. You would do well to keep moving through our town." The man stepped down into the street, his boots kicking up small clouds of dust. He stopped a few feet from Eleanor, close enough that she could see the weathered lines around his eyes and the old scar that ran along his jaw. He did not look at her, keeping his gaze fixed on Wells and the other men. "I am making it my business," he said calmly. The name is Everett Owens, and I was hired by the territorial governor to investigate reports of water rights violations in this area. I have been listening to what people have been saying, and I have been watching who does the talking. So far, the only person who has made any sense is this woman right here. Eleanor felt her breath catch in her throat. She had not expected anyone to stand up for her, least of all a complete stranger who had nothing to gain and everything to lose by going against men like Harrison Wells. Wells took a step forward, his hand moving toward the gun at his hip. "You calling me a liar? I am calling you a thief," Everett said, and though his voice remained level, there was an edge to it now, sharp as broken glass. "And if you draw that weapon, I will assume you are confessing to more than just water theft." The tension in the air was thick enough to choke on. For a long moment, nobody moved. Then Wells slowly lowered his hand, though his eyes promised violence later. He turned and stalked away, his boots heavy on the wooden sidewalk. The crowd began to disperse, people hurrying back to their business with sidelong glances at Eleanor and the stranger who had defended her. Eleanor stood there in the middle of the street, her heart still racing, unsure what to say or do. She felt exposed, vulnerable in a way she had not felt in years. The shame of being so publicly judged warred with a fierce pride that she had spoken up at all. Everett finally turned to look at her, and his expression softened slightly. "Are you all right, miss?" "I am fine," she said, though her voice shook just a little. "Thank you for what you said. You did not have to do that." He tipped his hat slightly. "Your thoughts matter more than anyone else's here," he said. "You are the only one who seems to care about what is right instead of what is profitable." Eleanor felt something warm unfold in her chest, something that had nothing to do with the Arizona heat. She looked up at him, really looked at him, and saw something in his eyes that she had not seen in the eyes of any man in this town: respect. "I am Eleanor Ramsey," she said, extending her hand the way her father had taught her, firm and confident despite the trembling in her fingers. He took her hand, his grip warm and steady. "Everett Owens, pleased to make your acquaintance, Miss Ramsey." They stood there in the dusty street, hands clasped, and Eleanor felt the world shift beneath her feet in a way that had nothing to do with earthquakes or gunshots. She felt seen, truly seen, for the first time since she had arrived in Casa Grande. "Perhaps we should move out of the middle of the street," Everett suggested, a hint of amusement in his voice. "In my experience, standing in the open after making enemies is not the wisest course of action." Eleanor could not help the small laugh that escaped her. "You may have a point. Would you like to come to my aunt's boarding house? I suspect we have much to discuss about the water situation." "I would appreciate that," he said, and together they walked toward the edge of town where the boarding house stood, a two-story structure with a wrap-around porch and faded yellow paint that had once been bright as sunshine. As they walked, Eleanor was acutely aware of the stares that followed them, the whispers that started up again like cicadas after a moment of silence. She kept her head high, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing her shame. Beside her, Everett walked with an easy confidence that she envied, as if he did not care one bit what anyone thought of him. "How long have you been in Casa Grande?" she asked, partly to break the silence and partly because she genuinely wanted to know. "3 days," he replied. "I have been staying at the hotel and asking questions. The territorial governor received several complaints about the water situation, but the letters were anonymous. People are afraid to speak up." "With good reason," Eleanor said bitterly. "Harrison Wells owns half the businesses in town. He could ruin someone with a word. He already has more than once." Everett glanced at her. "Yet you spoke up anyway. That took courage. Or foolishness," she said. "My aunt warned me to keep my opinions to myself." She said that in a town like this, a woman who speaks her mind is asking for trouble. And what do you think? Eleanor looked up at him, surprised by the question. Nobody had ever asked her what she thought, not really. They told her what to think, what to say, how to behave. But this stranger, this man who owed her nothing, was asking her opinion as if it mattered. I think, she said slowly, that staying silent when you see injustice is the same as being part of it. I think that if everyone is too afraid to speak, then the bad men win. I think that sometimes you have to do what is right even when it is hard, even when everyone tells you to stop, even when you are standing alone. Everett was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke again, his voice was soft. You are not standing alone anymore. They reached the boarding house, and Eleanor led him up the steps to the porch where her aunt, Martha Ramsey, was sitting in a rocking chair with mending in her lap. Martha was a woman in her late 50s, with gray-streaked hair and worry lines etched deep around her mouth. She looked up as they approached, her expression shifting from surprise to concern. Eleanor, she said, setting aside her mending, I heard what happened in town. Are you all right? I am fine, Aunt Martha, Eleanor assured her. This is Everett Owens. He is investigating the water situation for the territorial governor. I invited him to speak with us. Martha's eyes narrowed slightly as she assessed Everett, but then she nodded. Any enemy of Harrison Wells is welcome under my roof. Come inside, both of you. I will make coffee. The inside of the boarding house was cool and dim, a welcome relief from the brutal sun. The parlor was furnished simply but comfortably, with worn but clean furniture and lace curtains at the windows. Eleanor gestured for Everett to take a seat while Martha disappeared into the kitchen. Your aunt seems protective of you, Everett observed, settling into one of the chairs. She has reason to be, Eleanor said, sitting across from him. I have not made things easy for her since I arrived. I keep speaking up when I should stay quiet, asking questions when I should accept the answers I am given. She worries that I will never find a husband if I continue this way. And is that what you want? A husband? Eleanor considered the question carefully. I want what any woman wants, I suppose. A home of my own, a family, someone to share my life with. But I do not want it at the cost of pretending to be someone I am not. I do not want to spend my life biting my tongue and smiling while men make decisions that affect everyone without caring about the consequences. Then you want a partner, Everett said, not a master. Yes, Eleanor breathed, relieved that he understood. Exactly that. Martha returned with coffee and a plate of biscuits, and for the next hour they talked about the water situation in Casa Grande. Everett explained that Harrison Wells and 2 other ranchers had purchased the land surrounding the main creek that fed into the town, effectively controlling the water supply. They were charging exorbitant fees for access, and those who could not pay were forced to either leave or make do with contaminated water from other sources. It is legal, technically, Everett said, his frustration evident. They own the land, so they own the water rights. But the territorial governor believes they acquired the land through fraud, possibly by intimidating or deceiving the previous owners. If I can prove that, I can invalidate the sales and return control of the water to the community. What do you need to prove it? Eleanor asked, leaning forward. Evidence? Documents, witness testimony, anything that shows how they acquired the land, but people are too scared to talk, and any records that might have existed have conveniently disappeared. Eleanor exchanged a glance with her aunt. There might be something, she said slowly. My uncle kept detailed records of everything that happened in this town. He believed in documenting the truth, even when it was uncomfortable. He died 6 months ago, but his journals might have information about the land sales. Martha nodded, though her expression was troubled. They are in the attic. He was very particular about keeping records, but I have not had the heart to go through them since he passed. May I see them? Everett asked gently. Of course, Martha said. If it will help stop those men, then my husband would have wanted his work to mean something. Eleanor led Everett up the narrow stairs to the attic, a cramped space filled with trunks and boxes covered in dust. The heat up there was stifling, and Eleanor could feel sweat trickling down her back as she searched through the trunks until she found the one filled with her uncle's leather-bound journals. There were dozens of them, each one labeled with dates spanning nearly 20 years. He wrote in these every night, Eleanor said, running her hand over the worn covers. My aunt used to tease him about it, said he was more faithful to his journals than to her. Everett knelt beside her, helping to lift the journals out of the trunk. Their hands brushed, and Eleanor felt that strange warmth again, a flutter in her stomach that had nothing to do with the heat. She glanced at him and found him watching her, his gray eyes intense and thoughtful. You remind me of him, she said quietly. My uncle. He cared about doing what was right, too. He was not afraid to stand up for people who could not stand up for themselves. He sounds like a good man. He was. This town is poorer for his loss. They carried the journals downstairs and spread them out on the dining room table. Martha brought more coffee, and they began to read, searching for any mention of the land sales or Harrison Wells. The afternoon wore on into evening, the light fading through the windows as they pored over page after page of her uncle's careful handwriting. It was nearly midnight when Eleanor found it. She sat up straight, her exhaustion forgotten as she read the entry from 2 years ago. Everett, she said urgently, listen to this. She read aloud. Harrison Wells visited the Johnsons today with papers for them to sign. He told them it was a new water sharing agreement, but when I examined the documents later at Ellie Johnson's request, I discovered it was actually a deed transfer for their land. Ellie cannot read, and Wells took advantage of that. I advised Ellie not to sign, but Wells threatened to cut off their water access entirely if they refused. They have 3 children and cannot afford to move. I fear Wells will get his way through coercion, and there is nothing I can do to stop it. The law is on his side, even if morality is not. Eleanor looked up at Everett, her heart pounding. This is it. This is the fraud you need to prove. Everett took the journal carefully, reading the entry himself. His expression was grim. This is a start, but I need more. I need the Johnsons to testify to what happened. They left town 8 months ago, Martha said from the doorway. Packed up everything and went back east, said they could not make a living here anymore. Do you know where they went? Everett asked. Martha shook her head. They did not say. They were too ashamed, I think. Losing your land like that, it breaks something in a man. Eleanor felt a surge of anger so intense it made her hands shake. This is what I have been trying to tell people. This is why I cannot stay silent. Men like Wells destroy lives and feel no remorse, and everyone just accepts it as the way things are. Everett reached across the table and covered her hand with his. The gesture was simple, but it steadied her, grounded her in a way that words could not. We will find a way to stop him, he said firmly. I promise you that. They continued reading through the journals late into the night, finding more instances of suspicious dealings and coerced agreements. By the time Martha finally insisted they get some rest, they had a substantial list of people who had been wronged by Wells and his associates. Everett stayed in one of the boarding house rooms that night, and Eleanor lay awake in her own bed, her mind racing with everything they had discovered. She thought about Everett, about the way he had stood up for her in the street, the way he listened when she spoke as if her words had weight and value. She thought about the warmth of his hand on hers, the steadiness in his eyes. She barely knew him, but already she felt something growing between them, something she had never experienced before. The next morning, Eleanor woke early and went downstairs to find Everett already in the kitchen, drinking coffee and talking quietly with Martha. He looked up as she entered, and the smile that crossed his face made her heart skip. "Good morning," he said. "I was just telling your aunt that I plan to visit some of the people mentioned in the journals today. I was hoping you might come with me." "Me?" Eleanor said, surprised. "Why?" "Because people trust you," he said simply. "Because you have been here long enough to know who they are and what they have suffered. And because your uncle's journals should be represented by someone who knew him and understood what he was trying to accomplish." Eleanor looked at her aunt, who nodded. "Go," Martha said, "but be careful. Harrison Wells does not like to be challenged." They spent the day riding to small farms and homesteads scattered around Casa Grande, talking to families who had been forced to give up their land or pay impossible fees for water. At first, people were reluctant to speak, eyeing Everett with suspicion and Eleanor with concern. But Eleanor had a way of putting them at ease, of making them understand that she was not there to judge but to help. And when they saw how Everett listened, really listened, to what they had to say, they began to open up. By late afternoon, they had collected written statements from 8 families, each one detailing how Harrison Wells or his associates had used threats, fraud, or coercion to take their land or extort money from them. It was more than enough evidence to launch an investigation, possibly even criminal charges. They stopped to rest beside a small creek, letting their horses drink while they sat in the shade of a cottonwood tree. Eleanor pulled off her hat and wiped the sweat from her forehead, feeling exhausted but exhilarated. "You were amazing today," Everett said, his voice full of admiration. "The way you talked to those families, the way you made them feel safe enough to tell their stories. I could not have done this without you." Eleanor felt her cheeks warm. "I only did what anyone would do." "No," he said firmly. "Most people would have stayed silent like you said yesterday. Most people would have been too afraid or too apathetic to get involved. But not you. You see injustice, and you cannot help but fight against it, even when it costs you." "It has cost me," Eleanor admitted. "My reputation in this town is already damaged. Women cross the street to avoid talking to me. Men look at me like I am something dangerous or distasteful. My aunt worries I will end up a spinster with no prospects." Everett was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke, his voice was soft. "Do you care what they think?" Eleanor considered the question. "I care," she said honestly. "It hurts to be judged and found wanting. It hurts to be made to feel ashamed for having thoughts and opinions. But I care more about doing what is right. I care more about being true to myself than about being liked." "Good," Everett said. "Because the people whose opinions actually matter, they see you for who you really are. They see your courage and your compassion and your fierce sense of justice. They see someone worth admiring." Eleanor looked at him, and the intensity in his gaze took her breath away. "Is that what you see when you look at me?" "Yes," he said without hesitation. "And more." The air between them seemed to thicken, charged with something Eleanor could not quite name but felt in every fiber of her being. She wanted to ask what he meant by more, wanted to lean closer and see if he would close the distance between them. But before she could find the courage, they heard the sound of hoofbeats approaching fast. Everett was on his feet instantly, his hand moving to his gun. Eleanor stood as well, her heart hammering as 3 riders appeared over the rise. She recognized them immediately, Harrison Wells and 2 of his ranch hands, all armed and looking grim. "Well, well," Wells said, reining in his horse a few yards away. "The meddling woman and her hired gun. I heard you have been going around asking questions, stirring up trouble." "We have been collecting evidence of your crimes," Everett said calmly. I have statements from multiple witnesses detailing fraud, coercion, and theft. The territorial governor will be very interested to hear about your business practices." Wells laughed, but there was no humor in it. Statements from who? Illiterate farmers and desperate families who would say anything for a few dollars. No judge will take their word over mine. Perhaps not, Everett acknowledged, but they will take the word of a dead man whose journals document your activities in meticulous detail. They will take the physical evidence of fraudulent documents, and they will definitely take the word of a territorial investigator who has witnessed your attempts to intimidate witnesses. Wells' expression darkened. "You are making a mistake, Owens. I have powerful friends, men who do not take kindly to outsiders interfering in local business. Then I will add corruption and conspiracy to the charges," Everett said. His voice remained level, but Eleanor could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hand hovered near his gun. "I am warning you," Wells said, his voice dropping to a dangerous growl. "Leave Casa Grande. Take your evidence and your questions and get out. If you do not, well, the desert has a way of swallowing people up without a trace." "Is that a threat?" "It is a promise." Eleanor stepped forward before she could think better of it. "You do not scare us, Mr. Wells. Your time of terrorizing this town is over. People are finally willing to speak up, and no amount of threats will silence them now." Wells turned his cold gaze on her. "You should have kept your mouth shut, Miss Ramsey. A woman who does not know her place tends to meet an unfortunate end. Ask around, you will find I am not the first to think so." The threat was clear, and Eleanor felt ice slide down her spine despite the heat. But she refused to back down, refused to let him see her fear. "If anything happens to me or to Mr. Owens, there are copies of all the evidence in safe hands. Hurting us will only make things worse for you." It was a bluff, but Wells did not know that. He stared at them for a long moment, his jaw working. Then he jerked his horse's head around. "This is not over," he said, and spurred his mount into a gallop. His ranch hands followed, leaving Eleanor and Everett alone in a cloud of dust. Eleanor felt her knees go weak, and she sat down abruptly on the ground. Everett was beside her in an instant, his hands on her shoulders. "Are you all right?" he asked urgently. "I am fine," she managed, though her voice shook. "Just frightened, I suppose." He means what he said about the desert swallowing people. There have been others who stood up to him and they disappeared or had accidents. Everett's face was grim. "I know, which is why we need to move quickly. I am going to send a telegram to the territorial governor tonight requesting immediate assistance. With any luck, we will have federal marshals here within a few days. And until then, you stay close to the boarding house. I will stay there as well, keep watch." Wells would be a fool to try anything now that he knows we have evidence, but desperate men do foolish things. They rode back to Casa Grande in thoughtful silence, the sun beginning to set behind them in a spectacular display of orange and red. Eleanor kept thinking about what Wells had said about women not knowing their place. It was what everyone had been telling her in one way or another since she arrived in this town. Stay quiet, stay meek, stay invisible. Let the men handle things, but she could not. It went against every fiber of her being to stand by and do nothing while people suffered. And now, for the first time in her life, she had found someone who understood that, who valued her opinions and her courage instead of trying to diminish them. "Everett," she said suddenly, "thank you." He looked at her puzzled. "For what?" "For making me feel like I am not crazy. For making me feel like my thoughts and my voice matter. Everyone else in this town has tried to make me feel ashamed for having opinions, but you made me feel valued instead." His expression softened, and he reached over to take her hand, right there on horseback where anyone could see. "Eleanor, You are the least crazy person I have met in this whole territory. Your thoughts matter more than anyone else's here, because you are the only one brave enough to think them and speak them. Do not ever let anyone make you feel ashamed for that." Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes, but they were good tears. Tears of relief and gratitude and something deeper that she was not quite ready to name. She squeezed his hand, holding on like he was the only solid thing in a world that kept trying to knock her down. They arrived back at the boarding house as night was falling. Martha had supper waiting and they ate while filling her in on everything that had happened. Martha's face grew pale when she heard about the confrontation with Wells. "He will not stop," she said quietly. "He has too much to lose." "You both need to be very careful." "We will be," Everett assured her. "I am going to send that telegram first thing tomorrow morning. In the meantime, I will make sure nothing happens to either of you." After supper, Eleanor walked out onto the porch to get some air. The night was cooler than the day but still warm, and the stars were brilliant overhead, undimmed by any competing lights. She heard the door open behind her and knew without looking that it was Everett. "Could not sleep?" he asked, coming to stand beside her at the railing. "Too much on my mind," she admitted. "I keep thinking about everything that has happened in the last 2 days. It feels like my whole life has shifted somehow." "Mine too," he said quietly. She looked up at him, searching his face in the dim light. "What will you do after this is resolved?" "Will you move on to the next investigation?" "Probably," he said. "That is the nature of my work. I go where I am needed, solve the problem, and then move on." Eleanor felt her heart sink. She had known him for less than 2 days, but already the thought of him leaving felt like losing something precious. "That must be lonely." "It is," he admitted. "Or it was until I met you," her breath caught. "Everett." He turned to face her fully, and in the starlight she could see the emotion in his eyes, raw and honest. "I know this is fast. I know we barely know each other, but Eleanor, I have never met anyone like you. You are fierce and brave and so full of conviction. You see what is wrong with the world and you fight to make it right, even when it costs you everything. You are extraordinary, and I cannot stop thinking about what it would be like to have you in my life, not just for a few days, but for always." Eleanor felt like the world had tilted on its axis. "I feel the same way," she whispered. "I have never felt this way about anyone before, like I can finally be myself without hiding or pretending, like someone finally sees me for who I really am and values that instead of trying to change it." Everett reached up and cupped her face in his hands, his touch gentle despite the calluses on his palms. "I do see you, and what I see is the most remarkable woman I have ever known." Then he kissed her, soft and sweet and full of promise. Eleanor melted into him, her hands gripping his shirt as if to anchor herself against the tide of emotion that threatened to sweep her away. The kiss deepened, becoming something urgent and desperate, as if they both knew how fragile this moment was, how easily it could be torn away from them. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Everett rested his forehead against hers. "I do not want to leave," he said. "I do not want to move on to the next town and the next investigation. I want to stay here with you." "Then stay," Eleanor said. "After this is over, after Wells is dealt with, stay. Help me rebuild this town into something better. Help me fight for the people who cannot fight for themselves. You would want that. A life with a man who makes powerful enemies and never stays in one place for long." "I would want a life with you," she said firmly. "Whatever that looks like. I would rather have a dangerous life full of purpose with you than a safe, empty life without you." He kissed her again, and this time it felt like a vow, a promise of something deeper than words could express. When they finally went inside, they sat up talking until the early hours of the morning, learning each other's stories. sharing their dreams and fears and hopes for the future. Eleanor told him about growing up in Kansas, about her father who had encouraged her to think for herself, and her mother who had died when she was young. She told him about coming to Casa Grande to help her aunt, and feeling stifled by the expectations placed on women, the constant pressure to be quiet and obedient and agreeable. Everett told her about his childhood in Texas, about losing his family to illness and spending years drifting from place to place looking for purpose. He told her about becoming a territorial investigator, about finding meaning in fighting for justice even when it meant making enemies and putting himself in danger. "I was starting to wonder if this was all there was," he confessed. "Moving from town to town, solving problems, and then leaving before I could get attached to anyone or anything. But now, sitting here with you, I realize I was not looking for a place to belong. I was looking for a person." Eleanor felt her heart swell with emotion so intense it almost hurt. "You belong with me," she said. "And I belong with you. I knew it the moment you stood up for me in that street." The next morning, Everett went into town to send his telegram while Eleanor stayed at the boarding house with Martha. The hours dragged by, each minute feeling like an eternity as Eleanor waited for him to return. She tried to occupy herself with chores, but her mind kept wandering back to the night before, to the feel of his lips on hers, the promise in his words. When he finally returned, his expression was troubled. "The telegraph lines are down," he said. "Cut sometime during the night. It is too much of a coincidence." "Wells," Eleanor said grimly. "Most likely. He is trying to isolate us, cut us off from help." Everett paced the parlor, his hand running through his hair in frustration. "The nearest working telegraph is 2 days' ride from here. We could send someone, but that would leave you vulnerable." "Then we do not send anyone," Eleanor said. "We handle this ourselves." "Eleanor, that is exactly what Wells wants. If we confront him without backup, he can make us disappear and no one will ever know what happened." "So what do you suggest? That we hide here and wait for him to come for us?" Before Everett could answer, they heard a commotion outside. Eleanor rushed to the window and saw a crowd gathering in the street. Smoke was rising from somewhere in town, thick and black against the bright blue sky. "Fire," Martha said from behind them, her voice tight with fear. They ran outside and saw flames engulfing the general store, the same place where Eleanor had confronted the crowd 2 days ago. People were running with buckets of water, trying desperately to contain the blaze, but the building was old and dry and the fire spread quickly. Eleanor started toward the fire, but Everett caught her arm. "Wait," he said, his eyes scanning the crowd. "Something is wrong." Then Eleanor saw it. Most of the men were at the fire, but Harrison Wells and his ranch hands were nowhere to be seen. "It is a distraction," she breathed. "He is using the fire to draw everyone away." "From what?" Everett asked, but even as he spoke, understanding dawned in his eyes. "The boarding house. The journals." They ran back inside and found Martha frantically gathering the journals from the dining room table. "Help me," she gasped. "We need to hide these." Working together, they carried the journals up to Eleanor's room and stuffed them under the floorboards beneath her bed, a hiding place her uncle had built years ago for valuables. They had just replaced the boards when they heard the sound of breaking glass downstairs. Everett drew his gun. "Stay here," he ordered, moving toward the door. "Not a chance," Eleanor said, grabbing the small pistol her uncle had given her when she first arrived. She might not be an expert shot, but she knew how to use it. They crept downstairs and saw 3 men ransacking the parlor, throwing furniture aside and tearing through drawers. Harrison Wells stood in the doorway, watching with a cold smile. "Looking for something?" Everett asked, his gun leveled at Wells. Wells did not even flinch. "Just the journals that belong to me. documents that were stolen from my property." "They were not stolen and they do not belong to you," Eleanor said, her own gun shaking slightly in her hands. "They belong to my uncle and they detail your crimes." "Crimes," Wells repeated mockingly. "I have broken no laws. Everything I have done has been perfectly legal. Those journals are full of the delusional ramblings of an old man who did not understand how business works." "Then you have nothing to fear from them," Everett said. "Put them back and leave." Wells' smile widened. "I do not think so. You see, there is going to be another tragic accident today. A fire at a boarding house probably started by a careless guest. The owner, her niece, and an unfortunate investigator all perished trying to save each other. Very sad, very heroic, and very convenient." Eleanor felt ice flood her veins as she realized what he was planning. She saw one of the ranch hands holding a can of kerosene, saw another with a box of matches. They were going to burn the boarding house down with them inside. "You will never get away with this," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "I already have," Wells said. "Everyone is too busy fighting the fire in town to notice another one, and even if they did, well, accidents happen, especially to people who do not know when to mind their own business." Martha appeared at the top of the stairs, a shotgun in her hands. "Get out of my house," she said, her voice cold as winter. Wells looked up at her and laughed. "The widowed boarding house owner playing hero, how touching." "I am not playing," Martha said and fired. The shot went wide, but it was enough to startle Wells and his men. In the confusion, Everett lunged forward and tackled the man with the kerosene can. Eleanor moved to help, but Wells grabbed her, his arm around her throat, choking off her air. "Drop the gun, Owens," Wells snarled, "or I break her neck." Everett froze, his gun still in his hand but his face twisted with anguish. "Let her go." "Drop it." Time seemed to slow down. Eleanor could feel Wells' grip tightening, could feel her vision starting to blur. She thought about everything she had fought for, everything she had said and done to make a difference in this town. She thought about Everett, about the future they had talked about building together. She would not let it end like this. She would not let Wells win. With the last of her strength, Eleanor drove her elbow back into Wells' ribs as hard as she could. His grip loosened just enough for her to twist away, gasping for air. The gunshot was deafening in the small space. Eleanor hit the floor and looked up to see Wells staggering back, a red stain spreading across his shoulder. Everett's gun was smoking. "I would not move if I were you," Everett said, his voice deadly calm as he aimed at Wells' chest. The other ranch hands froze, their hands away from their weapons. Martha kept her shotgun trained on them from the stairs. It was over. The sheriff arrived minutes later, drawn by the gunshots. He took one look at the scene and his face went pale. "What in God's name is happening here?" "Harrison Wells attempted to destroy evidence of his crimes and kill 3 witnesses," Everett said, showing his territorial investigator badge. "I have documented proof of fraud, coercion, and now attempted murder. I need you to take these men into custody while I arrange for federal marshals to transport them to territorial court." The sheriff looked between Wells, who was sitting on the floor holding his wounded shoulder, and Everett, who still held his gun steady. "On what authority?" "On the authority of the territorial governor and the United States government," Everett said. "Now are you going to do your job, or are you going to join them in jail?" The sheriff swallowed hard and pulled out his handcuffs. The next few days were a blur of activity. Federal marshals arrived and took Wells and his associates into custody. The investigation expanded to include 2 other men who had been part of the water scheme, and within a week, the territorial governor had voided all the fraudulent land sales and returned control of the water to the community. Eleanor became something of a hero in Casa Grande. though she felt uncomfortable with the attention. Women who had crossed the street to avoid her now stopped to thank her. Men who had mocked her for speaking up now asked for her opinion on town matters. The shame that had followed her like a shadow had lifted, replaced by respect and gratitude. But more than any of that, she had Everett. True to his word, he stayed in Casa Grande after the investigation was complete. He resigned his position as a territorial investigator and used his savings to buy a small ranch on the outskirts of town, land that had been returned to the community as part of the settlement. Eleanor divided her time between helping her aunt at the boarding house and working alongside Everett to build a new life. 6 months after that fateful day in the street, Everett asked Eleanor to marry him. He did it simply, without grand gestures or fancy words, just the two of them sitting on the porch of his ranch house watching the sunset. "Marry me," he said, taking her hand. "Be my partner in everything. Help me build this ranch into something we can be proud of. Raise children with me who will grow up knowing that their thoughts and opinions matter. Grow old with me." Eleanor felt tears streaming down her face, but she was smiling. "Yes," she said. "Yes to all of it." They were married in the spring of 1883, in a simple ceremony at the boarding house with Martha and half the town in attendance. Eleanor wore a dress of pale blue silk that Martha had helped her sew, and Everett wore his best suit, though he looked uncomfortable in anything that was not work clothes. The Reverend spoke about partnership and mutual respect, about building a life together based on equality and trust. When Everett slipped the ring on Eleanor's finger, he looked into her eyes and said, "I promise to always value your voice, to always listen to your thoughts, and to never make you feel ashamed for being exactly who you are." Eleanor could barely speak past the lump in her throat. "I promise to stand beside you in everything, to fight for what is right, and to love you with everything I am." They kissed, and the crowd erupted in applause. As they walked back down the aisle together, Eleanor caught sight of the women in the front row, the same women who had once whispered about her behind their fans. Now they were smiling, some of them crying happy tears. She realized that she had not just changed her own life by speaking up. She had shown other women that it was possible to have a voice, to have opinions, to be more than what society expected them to be. The years that followed were not easy, but they were good. Eleanor and Everett worked the ranch together, building it into a successful operation that employed several families from town. They became known for their fair treatment of workers and their willingness to help those in need. Eleanor continued to speak up about injustices in the community, but now people listened instead of shaming her. She became an advocate for women's rights and children's education, working to establish the town's first school and fighting for laws that would protect families from the kind of exploitation Wells had practiced. In 1884, they welcomed their first child, a son they named Thomas after Eleanor's uncle. He was a healthy baby with his mother's green eyes and his father's stubborn determination. 2 years later came another son, James, who was quieter but just as strong-willed as his brother. And in 1888, they had a daughter, Sarah, who inherited her mother's fierce spirit and her father's sense of justice. Eleanor raised her children to think for themselves, to question authority when it was wrong, and to stand up for what they believed in. She taught her daughter that being a woman did not mean being silent, and she taught her sons that respecting women meant valuing their thoughts and opinions as much as their own. Everett proved to be as good a father as he was a husband. He was patient and kind, teaching his children about the land and the animals, about honor and integrity. He never once told Eleanor to soften her edges or temper her opinions. Instead, he stood beside her in everything, his partner in the truest sense of the word. Martha lived to see all three of her great-nieces and great-nephews born. She passed away peacefully in her sleep in 1890, content in the knowledge that her husband's journals had made a difference and that her niece had found the kind of love she deserved. Casa Grande flourished in the years following Wells' downfall. With fair access to water restored, new families moved in and businesses thrived. The school that Eleanor had fought so hard to establish became one of the best in the territory, educating boys and girls equally. The town became known as a place where justice mattered and where everyone's voice was heard. As Eleanor grew older, she never forgot what it felt like to be shamed for having opinions. She never forgot the isolation of standing alone in that dusty street, speaking truth to power while everyone watched and judged. But she also never forgot the moment Everett had stood beside her and told her that her thoughts mattered more than anyone else's. That moment had changed everything, had given her the courage to keep fighting, to keep speaking up, to keep being herself even when it was hard. On their 25th wedding anniversary in 1908, Eleanor and Everett sat on the porch of their ranch house, their children grown with families of their own. The sun was setting over the desert, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Eleanor leaned against her husband, feeling the solid warmth of him, the steady beating of his heart. "You ever regret it?" she asked quietly. "Giving up your career as an investigator to stay here with me?" Everett wrapped his arm around her and pulled her closer. "Not for a single moment. You gave me something I did not even know I was looking for. A home, a purpose beyond the next investigation, a reason to put down roots and build something lasting. You gave me something too," Eleanor said. "You made me believe that having a voice and having love were not mutually exclusive. You made me believe that I did not have to choose between being true to myself and being with someone. You showed me that the right person would value what others saw as flaws." "They were never flaws," Everett said firmly. "Your voice, your passion, your unwillingness to accept injustice, those are the things that make you extraordinary. Those are the things I fell in love with." Eleanor turned to kiss him, the same warmth and promise in it that had been there on that first kiss 26 years ago. "I love you," she said. "Thank you for seeing me." "Always," he replied. "Always." As the stars began to appear overhead, one by one like diamonds scattered across black velvet, Eleanor thought about the journey that had brought her here. She thought about the scared, angry woman she had been, standing alone in the street and refusing to back down. She thought about finding Everett, about building a life and a family together, about all the battles they had fought and won side by side. She thought about the legacy they were leaving for their children and grandchildren, a legacy of standing up for what was right, of valuing every voice, of building partnerships based on mutual respect and love. She thought about all the women in Casa Grande who no longer felt ashamed for having opinions, who spoke up at town meetings and ran businesses and made decisions about their own lives. And she knew, with absolute certainty, that every moment of struggle had been worth it. Every time she had been shamed or judged or told to be quiet, she had pushed back, and in doing so she had helped change not just her own life but the lives of countless others. The cowboy who had told her that her thoughts mattered more than anyone else's had become her husband, her partner, her best friend. Together they had built something beautiful and lasting, a love story that would be told in Casa Grande for generations to come. A story about a woman who refused to be silenced and a man who valued her voice above all others. A story about standing up for what was right, even when you stood alone. A story about finding love in the most unexpected places and building a life based on mutual respect, trust, and unwavering support. As the night deepened around them, Eleanor and Everett sat together in comfortable silence, watching the stars and thinking about the life they had built together. There would be more challenges ahead, more injustices to fight, more voices to raise in defense of what was right. But they would face them together, just as they always had. And in that moment, sitting on their porch with the desert stretching out before them and the man she loved beside her, Eleanor Ramsey Owens knew that she had everything she had ever wanted. She had a voice that mattered. She had work that gave her purpose. She had a family that she loved with her whole heart. And most of all, she had a partner who saw her for exactly who she was and loved her not in spite of her fierce spirit, but because of it. The story that had begun with shame and judgment had ended with love and triumph. And as Eleanor drifted off to sleep that night, her head on Everett's shoulder, she smiled, knowing that their story would continue through their children and their children's children, a legacy of courage and love that would never be forgotten in the town of Casa Grande, Arizona.